Okay. Hi, Lisa. Lisa Smartt. You've the author of this very brilliant book, "Words at the Threshold." Words at the Threshold. What we say as we're nearing death, and in my estimation, you gave me the honor of endorsing your book, and in my estimation, it's really, besides being brilliant, a shifting, paradigm changing
Mm,
book, and with far-reaching implications. So we're gonna talk a lot about your book and delve into it. But as I always do with these interviews, I'm always interested in knowing from a personal side, your own personal story to how you landed where you are now.
mm,
So I'll let you say a little bit about that.
Thank you. I've always loved language. I've been really curious about how language tracks the way we think and who we are, and many times the hidden things we are. So early on in my career and in my training, I studied gender and language at UC Berkeley with Robin Lakoff.
Hmm.
And back in the 80s, I was really intrigued by how people denote power relationships through language. For example, if someone's talking to someone and they say, "Nice day, isn't it?" and ask for someone else's approval, there's all these ways that language reflects consciousness, how we're thinking about ourselves and other people. And there are all these subtle ways that language communicates
Hmm.
about our lives. And then I landed up getting into, I studied linguistics, but professionally I landed up working with people who had learning disabilities like
Hmm.
dyslexia. Because again, I was really curious how language and consciousness worked hand in hand and why people couldn't process reading or spoken word and so forth. So that was part of what I did professionally. And I was trained in neurolinguistic programming, which again
Uh-huh.
looks at language and how. So that's just been a passion I've had my whole life, and I was trained at Berkeley in linguistics. And parallel to that, I've always been really curious about consciousness. I read
Hmm.
Raymond Moody's book when I was 17, as many of us did
Yeah,
with my.
and just that his groundbreaking book, Life After Life, that book.
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
yes, 1975. And I was very intrigued by that. So, I've always had sort of these two parallel interests. And when I was 53, they quite by accident or synchronistically intersected. And that was when my father very unexpectedly entered the dying process. It was
Oh.
about a 3 week process. My father was a PhD psychologist, very rationalist, very bright analyzer, strong analyzer, didn't believe in anything beyond this world at all, and also was
Hmm.
very much sort of salt of the earth kind of guy. And he was being treated for prostate cancer, and it looked like, like so many people with prostate cancer make it through just fine, but they over radiated him.
Oh.
And so he within a 3 week period he died. And as he entered that process, the dying process, and entered hospice, suddenly my father's language and perception seemed to shift in ways I had never seen
Hmm.
before. And again, he was a cigar chomping, down to earth, nothing exists beyond this world, New Yorker.
Hmm. Hmm.
And if I ever used the word angels, he would roll his eyes like, yeah, right.
Hmm.
No such thing. And
Hmm.
3 weeks, just about 3 weeks before he died, he started talking about seeing angels in the room.
Hmm.
And then 3 days before he died, he announced, enough, enough. The angels say enough, 3 days left.
Huh.
And that blew me away because I'd never heard my father,
Uh-huh.
say anything about
And
angels.
and was he fully lucid when he said 3 days before my death, or was he kind of like floating in and out of some sort of dreamy state?
He was definitely floating in and out. And so
Uh-huh.
not only were they, there was something like the perception of angels, but I also noticed that as he was moving in and out of different states, his language shifted in other ways. Not only did his perception seem to change in terms of seeing angels or, so forth, but also he started speaking much more symbolically. It was almost as if he was moving in and out of dream time, or
Oh,
or
oh,
another
oh,
dimension.
yeah.
Yeah, so here I was, and I just, because I was trained in linguistics, because I was really intrigued by how language tracks consciousness, I wrote down everything he said in those
Oh,
final 3 weeks,
uh-huh.
and that became sort of the beginning of this process of studying final words.
Oh, oh. No, that's fascinating. So it was a first-hand experience. Um, and as the title of the book, Words of the threshold is that place where before we leave this earthy plane. Um, so, so it's fascinating. So before we delve more, you mentioned Raymond Moody, and he wrote the book Life After Life, which, and he pretty much, or he pioneered and coined the term near-death experience. So I'm guessing he was an influence or a big influence. Are there other people, ideas that were also big influences to you?
In the very beginning, before in the very beginning, um, George Lakoff at Berkeley, who did a lot of research in metaphor, had influenced me and so forth. But after my father passed on, and I was very curious about what I saw in his final words, then I just began to read everybody I could. And one big
Oh,
influence was Final Gifts by two hospice nurses,
hmm.
Maggie Callanan and Patricia Kelly. And it was a really beautiful anecdotal look at the changes. Um, Mostly they focus on metaphors and final requests of end of life. And then I just read everybody I could, David Kessler, Susan Harrells. I mean, everybody who's written
Hmm.
on near death experience and nearing death. But Raymond, what happened synchronistically, is just as my father, right after my father passed away, and he was in Berkeley when this happened, I went to the linguistics library to see what had been written about the linguistics of end of life, assuming
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot written, because we know there's a lot about the language of infancy and toddlerhood. I just thought,
Mm-hmm.
well, there's going to be material. And there really was absolutely nothing about the structure of language as people die. Um, there was a lot about how doctors talk to patients, should talk about, but
Uh-huh.
nothing about really listening closely to what happens to language at end of life. And so, synchronistically, a few weeks after I started this process of reading and researching on my own, my mother had a friend who was going to be teaching with Raymond Moody in Alabama.
Oh.
I know, crazy. I mean, just it was.
Uh-huh.
And so he said, "Well, why don't you come with me?" And it was like $2,000. It was a 5-day seminar. I didn't have, I'm a teacher. I never have a lot of money on hand. And of course, my income tax refund came
Oh,
a few
the
days later.
stars lined up.
The stars lined up, and I thought, well, I'm taking this as a sign, and or just as a sign to move ahead. Jumped on a plane and was at this 5-day seminar with 15 other people from around the country with Raymond Moody, and a great friendship and
Oh.
partnership grew out of that
Uh-huh.
wonderful seminar.
Yeah. So Raymond Moody. I'll talk about Raymond Moody in a little while, but Raymond Moody is a scientist, a physician, psychiatrist, philosopher, and you are also a scientist, linguist, and so it's really great that you came from that background, a linguistic background. The study of linguistics is such a fascinating field, the study of language, what makes language, um, and so it sounds like you tackled it as a scientist. You started, as you said, read the literature to understand this later, just more, just delve into it more. And so, from what I understand, that after your father died and you started looking into this, you began this Final Words project, correct? So, what is the Final Words project?
The Final Words Project is an informal research project, and it's a gathering of data and analyzing of data. And I've collected samples from around Canada and the United States. and just samples of final words from
Hmm.
transcriptions of months and days to just short accounts of final words.
Yeah, yeah, and it's yeah, no, we never really thought about um, these final words. So, as you said, your dad said words that at that probably when he was talking, you never thought final words. But what was it about your dad's last words that you found so fascinating?
Well, partly what you had mentioned before, it asked about this moving in and out of what seemed like dimensions. Like I heard him he had an increase in metaphoric language. I noticed an increase in nonsensical language,
Hmm.
paradoxical language. He would say things like, my modality is broken, or
Hmm.
introductory offer, store is closing, which is
Hmm.
introductory offer and store is closing. There are these strange paradoxical phrases. And he spoke a lot in metaphors about a big event coming, the big art show coming, which landed up being a metaphor, I think, for dying, and we see that a lot in final words. So he started talking about moving upward in space and backwards in space. And as I mentioned, he talked about angels. So there was a range of language, but then he would also say, oh, Lisa, could you get me a cup of water, please? So I could see that it was moving in and out. And when I saw, it would have been easy for me to just dismiss it as medicines are doing it. Just
Hmm.
something's wrong with it.
Right.
But to see this kind of moving back and forth is what really struck me, and we rarely see that in the language of not of our lives, right? In
Hmm.
healthy ordinary, and also I saw much higher rate of repetition. We know that end of life language, so I just noted these things very informally, but through writing them down and through seeing these shifts of language patterns I never have seen in healthy living
Hmm.
speech. I thought, wow, is there some indication of the consciousness or something else?
Uh-huh.
Because as I looked at the patterns, it really seemed to me that it was more than just signs of a dying mind. There seemed to be
Hmm.
something else that was going on
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's why in reading your book, I that's why I said this is really paradigm shifting because you have explored and entered a portal that that we don't fully understand. I mean, Raymond Moody kicked it off with with deciphering, explaining, writing about near-death experience, but now you've taken it one step further to this the portal, the threshold, the language. What are people seeing while they're still here? So did you ever did your father's words introductory offer store what was the store closing?
Store closing for goods and services. I
Did
mean, just like,
that
yeah,
yeah did did
yeah.
did that could you even say that had some significance or metaphorically did, but I guess he's talking in multi-dimensional language, so to speak.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
one of the things, I'm sorry.
No, no, no. Yeah.
No, no.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really learned from Raymond is that one of the qualities of near death, the language of the near death experience, which is also seems to be a quality of the language of the threshold, is being paradoxical.
Mm-hmm.
So, for
Oh.
example, when people have near death experiences and then come back and talk about them, first of all, people say those experiences are ineffable. It's really hard to put words to them.
Uh-huh.
They're near death. They've died and gone to the afterlife or another
Mm-hmm.
dimension of had, but they just can't put words to it. They tell us.
Mm-hmm.
However, when they try to speak about it, the way they do is paradoxical. So they'll say things like, I never felt as alive as when I was dead.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that just, I mean, in our knowing of things, that makes no sense, right? That's a
Uh-huh.
paradox. Or it felt like 1 minute, but also an eternity when I was dead or in that state of
Uh-huh.
being. So Raymond noticed that there were these paradoxical phrases when people describe their near-death experiences. And I have found also that paradoxical phrases appear more in the language of the dying
Mm-hmm.
than they do in, again, ordinary,
Yeah.
healthy language. And especially when people talk about position in space, like, I'm going up so I can go down.
Uh-huh.
It's like one of the phrases I
Yeah.
heard. Yeah.
Yeah, they're really outside the three-dimensional realm. So I know that that you mentioned the word nonsensical, but the language, but really the use of saying nonsensical, the language isn't the nonsense we think of as gibberish, makes no sense. It's not, it's nonsense, non hyphen sense in the sense of our three dimensional logical realm, but there's, just to say it's kind of metaphorical, but there's a logic underlying it. What did you say?
Well, yes, I would say that, and I would say that there are different types of nonsense.
Ah,
We're not
uh-huh.
accustomed to thinking about studying nonsense as
Mm-hmm.
language, but nonsense is part of language. Look at Dr. Seuss.
Uh-huh.
People, or Alice in Wonderland, nonsense is part of the human repertoire in terms of language, right? So, one of the
Uh-huh.
things that I discovered in the end of life language, and of course, we're in the very early stages, but there are different types of nonsense. So there is also the gibberish that you mentioned that almost
Mm-hmm.
sounds like speaking in tongues.
Uh-huh.
We do see that, though I wasn't able to get real good
Oh.
transcriptions of it yet, but we
Uh-huh.
do. But we also see the kind of nonsense you're talking about, which is nonsense, not
Yeah.
rooted in the senses as we
Uh-huh.
know it. So I believe we're just at the very frontier. We're just beginning because I think that as we get more transcripts of the nonsense of the threshold, we're going to see that there are a variety of kinds of nonsense. And as I'm getting more, see, up until now, Raymond says there's something called a nonsense taboo. We hear nonsense in our minds just generally turn off, like
Uh-huh.
that's
Yeah.
not right because it
Right.
doesn't, right?
Yeah.
And so as I first started the Final Words Project and asked people to bring in their nonsense, people brought in nonsense that still sort of made sense.
Mm-hmm.
They brought in the easy nonsense stuff like there's an angel standing by my bed. Well, that's nonsense in terms of what we think about the real world.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's the nonsense of something like, yes, I would like some scrambled eggs, but where would you reappear?
Uh-huh.
Now that's like completely, you can't wrap your mind that linguistically you can't really hold that
Mm-hmm.
sentence, comprehend it in the same way as there's an angel standing by my bed, right there.
Mm-hmm.
That's more. So I think there are different types of nonsense, and I'm hoping that as we speak more about it and get past the nonsense taboo, I'll get more and more transcripts that
Mm-hmm.
really are also help me understand the gibberish and so forth. But what we do have so far is a wide range already of types of nonsense that include what I call prepositional shift when people start talking about space in really unusual ways. I got to go down there, I have to go down. I'm on top now, moving on top. Things like that when people are lying down completely still and they're talking about being on top,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's nonsense
Mm-hmm.
situation.
Yeah.
So anyway, so we see a range of nonsense, and I think we've really just begun because we still haven't gotten as much data as I think
Uh-huh.
exists in that language because
Huh.
we're just beginning the process of listening closely, I
Yeah.
think.
So it's really poetry in a way. What these words, these final words. So.
That is part of what really struck me because I am a poet. I love poetry, and as I was listening to my father's words, so one day he turned to me and he said, "Lisa, there is so much so in sorrow," meaning how grief
Mm.
stricken he was feeling.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't make sense
Uh-huh.
in but that's poetry, right?
Yeah.
There's so
Yeah.
much so.
Uh-huh.
And as I heard his language, I was just really struck by this,
Uh-huh.
just the quality of it. And William James talked about, how mystical language is often paradoxical, like, the whispering silence or the
Uh-huh.
illuminated darkness, those kinds of phrases that are poetic and mystical, but are, as you had mentioned, are not rooted in the senses as we know
Uh-huh.
it, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So it is poetic. And as I asked people to take transcriptions of their loved ones' words and write them down for the Final Words Project, I think many people were really surprised that as they wrote the words down, the power and the beauty of some of the words that otherwise had by health professionals or, they had dismissed
Mm-hmm.
until they actually wrote them down and saw the power and beauty of some of the words in the
Yeah,
language.
yeah, that's just amazing, and it just shows you the power of the non-linear word, the words that just are things that come to us that in flashes that we can't tie to the logical realm, and that reminds me of a story, not final words, but kind of illustrating this. There's a famous story of the scientist Steven Weinberg. He's a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He came up with one of the four forces of the universe. That's what he won I think the electroweak force won the Nobel Prize. And his idea came to him when he was teaching. I think he was at that point he was in Boston teaching at Harvard or MIT, and he was driving his car. He had a little red race car, and he was driving it, and it came to him in a flash, the idea that became the Nobel Prize winning idea. And yet at the same time, he, as a scientist, a logician, just didn't believe in any sort of consciousness, higher forces, whatever word you want to call. And so he had no explanation for how this idea came to him in a flash. And so same kind of thing. We want to hold on to our logical beliefs and have logical explanations for everything, but there's this whole world portal, and these people at the threshold are seeing it and kind of bringing us a language that is nonsense, outside our sensorial realm. So,
Absolutely. Yes, I agree completely. And what a great story. Thank you for
yeah,
that.
sure.
And, we hear this so often about scientists or anyone who are trying to solve problems, having dreams about them or getting
Hmm.
images. And one of the things, originally the book was called Words at the Threshold, because of the threshold of life and death. And yet for me, the threshold actually now has changed its meaning in some ways because I
Hmm.
believe there's a portal to kind of intuitive thinking also, that I
Uh-huh.
really have discovered that seems to be communicated almost in nonsensical imagery, or what we think of as nonsensical, but at least in symbolic imagery.
Hmm.
And I spoke to several psychics who shared with me that when they get an image that's nonsensical and kind of not your usual analytical, that's the stuff that they trust
Hmm.
as being the real psychic material. They
Yeah.
don't, that's what they know is it holds the
Hmm.
kernels of 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 truth. And how many stories have we heard from scientists and artists
Hmm.
and innovators? And Raymond really talks about nonsense being the harbinger of new frontiers, being the
Uh-huh.
harbinger of new things. Because if you look across time, many of the ideas that were first perceived, or at least thought of as nonsense, actually opened doors to very new ways of thinking. With Raymond, for example, he was a PhD in philosophy,
Hmm.
and he had a love for nonsense, and he loved
Hmm.
Alice in Wonderland and so forth.
Uh-huh.
So when he then went on to become a medical student, and he heard his patients who died, who had cardiac arrest, die and come back,
Hmm.
he noticed that the stories and the accounts that they were sharing were by all they were nonsensical.
Hmm.
Um, I went through a tunnel and saw light, and there were,
Hmm.
you know, and as I mentioned before, I never felt as alive as when I had this dying experience. There were these strange things, and he kept a record of everything that people said, and from that, the near-death experience emerged because while other people were dismissing the nonsense they heard, the doctor's like, oh, these people crazy, whatever, it's just nonsense.
Hmm.
Raymond said, well, let's see if there are patterns in this nonsense, because as a philosophy student, he realized that language generally, like many natural patterns in our lives,
Hmm.
fall into these kind of categories. So he wrote down what people said,
Hmm.
and then that is from that, the patterns emerged that became the near death experience. So when I heard that from him in that seminar that I took in Alabama very
Hmm.
early on, a light went on, and he said,
Yeah.
and then both of us were like, let's start collecting the data of the threshold to see if patterns emerge just as they
Yeah.
did with near death experience.
Yeah. So talking about the research, and it sounds like you're still conducting research, even though your book,
Yes.
yeah.
Oh,
How do you've mentioned how writings or words have come to you. I mean other people. So how do you conduct your research?
it's relatively informal. We have a website where people, we ask a number of questions and people can submit their accounts. And then I have different categories
Mm-hmm.
and I just see what patterns are emerging. Where's the metaphoric language? What are the patterns
Oh,
of, what symbols are appearing? What numbers are appearing? I have a spreadsheet and just
oh,
organizing
yeah.
patterns and non-referential. There's just patterns of language that appear. So when I get transcripts from people, I just kind of, and some utterances obviously will fall into different categories. But right now we're up to about 2,000. And it's been great with the book because through interviews, we've received more submissions. And I'm putting
Oh,
out the word for, please don't be shy about sending us
oh,
gibberish, really
uh-huh.
as nonsense is not a bad thing. Send it to us.
Yeah.
Because we have such a wonderful, a large amount of material about visitations at the bedside. Again, a lot of things that are
Uh-huh.
still amazing and awe-inspiring, and yet still fall more into sensical language. And we still really want to get the
Mm-hmm.
stuff that we think will get us closer to a greater understanding. So, we know with speaking in tongues, for example, where people are speaking gibberish, that brain scan research has shown that when people are doing the speaking in tongues, different parts of the brain are activated than when we're speaking regular literal speech. And
Mm-hmm.
those regions of the brain tend to be the same places that are highly connected to mystical experience and even musics and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. So I'm just so intrigued because I want to know more and more about the language we still haven't captured at the threshold to see what we might learn about it and how it might relate to consciousness.
Oh. Yeah, so your book in a way was really like a coming public with your work, and it's kind of opened doors for more data to come your way. And
Yes.
yeah, have you interested any other scientists or medical people to in any way? Because I know, like you mentioned in your book, Andrew Newberg, and
Oh, yeah, he's great.
who's a neurologist, or but he's done studies with what he calls the God spot in the brain, stimulating a certain area of the brain that leads people through yeah, not through medications or drugs, through just little impulses, electrical impulses, and it's led people to have these what they call euphoric experiences, like God. So has anyone like him or other people been tied in with?
We're just beginning, which is very exciting. Right now, it looks like I know at University of Pennsylvania they just applied for a grant. I don't know how the status of it, but
Mm-hmm.
they've been speaking about doing some research there. And Newberg, the study I just quoted about the speaking in tongues was actually
Mm-hmm.
something Newberg has done, and he's doing some wonderful research around mystical experience.
Oh.
And he anyway. But there is, and then I just met someone a month ago. I'm very excited at Stanford,
Uh-huh.
and she and I are looking at partnering and doing
Great.
some work there. And there's some really good work going on with Alzheimer's, and
Oh. Oh.
I'm just beginning now to extend my work because I've heard from several people who've done research that there are really some parallels between end of life language and Alzheimer's language of Alzheimer's. So, matter of fact, just this week, I'm going to spend a lot of time at the university here in Georgia looking at what's already been done around Alzheimer's and seeing,
Mm-hmm.
what the parallels are and what the differences. I already have some ideas about it, but I really need to read the research and see what's been done. But there's been a lot more done on Alzheimer's research than end of life. But I do think more people will get on board, and I'm beginning to get cross linguistic samples, get samples from different countries,
Uh-huh.
and there's
Oh.
and there's someone in Germany who's been doing a little bit of research on
Wow.
final words. So it's just very
Oh,
exciting.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's so
Woo.
that's yeah, it's so amazing. And the people you study, these people in the threshold, are they across cultures, young, old, or just in hospice or hospitals, or the range? Is that something you keep in the data too?
We do, but honestly, this is more on the range of informal and much more as a writer who's curious
Mm-hmm.
versus, an academic scientist. Because, I asked Raymond about it. I said, how crazy should we get about controlling everything and
Uh-huh.
tracking all this data? And, he said, look, this is sort of a pilot. We're just getting out there.
Yeah.
And he was right. He said the real data isn't going to come until after the book is out there and people really
Mm-hmm.
start having the conversation and he was right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, we left it very open in the beginning
Uh-huh.
because we didn't even know what we were looking for yet. So we didn't really want to close any doors.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but, we did get a range in terms of hospice and hospital, people who died at home. There was some range, and range of ages, but we weren't trying to make a perfectly, the perfect control sample. We weren't
Mm-hmm.
aiming for that. And that's just the truth. That's definitely, if there's a flaw, that's definitely a flaw. And yet it's a pilot. And we've begun to, I think, seen some very real patterns that are exciting and interesting
Yeah.
and just opens the door.
Yeah, and I agree. It opens the door. It brings it into the public awareness so it can become just a regular or an accepted understanding of, as people are in their threshold, their words and what the connections are, what they're trying to get at. And so are there, in analyzing and gathering data and phrases, words people have said, as much as you said, you've about 2,000 now, you said. Are there common themes or metaphors that appear in the speech?
Absolutely. The first thing that appears, I want to make sure I have the accurate quotes here, so I'm going to get
Yeah.
them in hand. Um, and again, this was already really talked about in Callanan and Kelly's book, Final Gifts, but we just were able to confirm it in a more formal way. People start talking in metaphors of a trip, right? Of travel.
Hmm.
Um, Yellow bus, there's the bus. Who's driving that bus, Grandma? Not sure, but lots of angels.
Hmm.
Um, you hear things like, take me to the bus station, it's time to go. So in the moment, people thinking, oh, Grandma's just losing her mind. What's she talking about? Because in isolation, it sounds like, this is just word salad. But when you look that in bedrooms and hospital rooms throughout the country, people are saying the same kinds of things.
Hmm.
That's what I guess science is, right? When we
Uh-huh.
begin to
Yeah.
start getting away from isolated cases
Right.
to more data. The boat has arrived for me. Common train, talking about trains and so forth. People start talking about a large event. I talked about my dad started speaking about the big art show, and usually those events are
Hmm.
closely related to people's lives. Like my mother's an artist, so for 50 something years, my dad, as he would say, schlepped boxes to the art show for my mother with great love. So
Hmm.
as he was dying, he was talking about the big art show and the boxes he had to bring there. But here is a few more where someone announces a big event. On the night my aunt died from lung cancer, she was clearly between two worlds. Her last words to me were when she asked me to bring her best dress and shoes to the hospital because she was attending a grand ball that night and would be so happy to see me there. She died the next day.
Hmm.
That's a really common, emerged several
Hmm.
times, the dance. Let's see. One beloved told his wife, Dave is telling me he's waiting for me. He's waiting to play golf with me. They need a fourth.
Hmm.
Um, so as I mentioned, the metaphors people use are really strongly connected often to what their lives were about.
Uh-huh.
Uh, Signature metaphors. I love this one from Jeffrey Holder, who is a dancer and
Oh,
choreographer,
yeah. Oh, sure. Well known.
well known. His very last words recorded by his son, arms 2, 3, turn 2, 3, swing 2, 3, down 2, 3.
Huh. Huh. Wow.
So, there's this poetic quality, but our lives have a poetic quality, right? I mean, through a certain lens, our
Uh-huh.
lives.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so anyway, so that's one of the things is you see these kinds of metaphors. And then within those metaphors, um, the whole notion of something breaking down,
Mm-hmm.
Lakoff says one of the metaphors culturally we have about our brains, it's like a machine, right? Our minds are a machine. So it's not surprising, at least in this language, in this culture, we hear a lot about the breakdown. Things are breaking down, things need to be fixed or repaired. And so people talk a lot in metaphors of breakdown. Certain
Hmm.
numbers and circles appear a lot, bringing two things together to one.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there are two holes here, honey. Hulls. This was a guy who loved boats. Honey, honey, I need to bring the two holes together. And it sounds like whole, Wholes.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so there's a lot of reference to bringing things, all the pieces that need to be brought together. So within this pattern of metaphors, you see certain types emerging. Repetition, there's a lot more repetition. I think I mentioned that earlier too. At end of life, we know Steve Jobs, oh wow, oh wow, oh
Huh.
wow. And
Huh.
that's really common. Let me get more of those too, excuse
So,
me.
so you're saying with Steve Jobs, that was his final, I mean, final word. That was as he passed away. That was his last. Yeah, if only we could say, Steve, what do you say? Or,
Yeah, and don't you
is there a
wish,
new
I know.
computer you've developed? But yeah, it's fascinating.
And you wonder, I look back at when my father was dying and he started talking about the angels in the corner, right before he left. And I wished, I was still, I think so many of us are, when someone we love is dying, we're still so afraid of death and dying and having those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And I was that way too. And I wish now I said, Dad, tell me more about those angels. I wish I had
Mm-hmm.
asked more questions. And
Mm-hmm.
anyway, so repetition, and we can only wonder, what Steve Jobs saw at the threshold.
Right,
So
sure.
those are some of the patterns. And as I mentioned earlier, we see many different types of nonsense that I talk about in my book. And one of them is people start talking about nonsensical people in the room with them. Oftentimes it's loved ones who had died before them, and different landscapes opening up, seeing beautiful
Uh-huh.
trees, landscapes, and
Yeah.
light.
Yeah. And in your opinion, what do you think end of life speech says about consciousness?
Well, in my opinion, what it says is there's a lot more going on than just a brain that's dying along with the body that's dying. There are many things I saw and discovered through my research, like terminal lucidity, where someone might be completely unresponsive even for years, and then right before they die, come out to say something like, I never told you that I loved you.
Hmm.
I loved you so deeply, or in one dramatic case, this gentleman who is a very trustworthy source, his mother came out and told him where all the uh, financial files were left. I mean, here was a woman, she had Alzheimer's, she was in a coma, came out right before she died. The financial files are in the third drawer down in the study. I just wanted you to know so you'd have everything organized, after I passed. He couldn't make, I mean, my God, that was stunning. So how can that happen? And research by Madeline Lawrence into coma survivors, people who come out of comas, 70% of them report being aware of things while they were in a coma. So what
Mm-hmm.
is that? Their bodies in many cases were, almost clinically dead or at least completely
Mm-hmm.
unresponsive. So something is surviving, and something I call sustained narratives. Anyway, there's so many things to me that indicate that there is some kind of survival of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the fact that these people on the final words are tapping into this realm of cosmic consciousness, expanded consciousness,
Yeah.
consciousness beyond the three-dimensional realm. I mean, that's what you're finding, and that's really where the gist of the paradigm shift. And that reminds me, talking about people coming out of comas. There's two books that have come out in the last couple of years, very big popular bestsellers. Both have been optioned into the potential of being made into movies. One is Eben Alexander's book, Proof of Heaven, and the other
Yeah.
is Anita Moorjani's book, Dying to Be Me.
Oh, that's a great book. Yeah,
Yeah, oh, they're both brilliant.
they're
And
both
her,
great.
yeah, they're both brilliant books. In her book, the last third of the book, she tries to language what she learned being in that coma. And Anita Moorjani, both Eben Alexander and Anita Moorjani were potentially in their last days, dying, and both came back and healed. Talking about consciousness, do you think there's a thread that connects their books, their stories with your work?
Oh,
Um,
most definitely. I mean, first with Anita's book, her book was so illuminating for me because I was speaking about the language of the near-death experience, and she speaks very clearly about how
right.
metaphor, and there's
Mm-hmm.
some wonderful quotes about how she couldn't speak about her experience without metaphor because otherwise it was
Mm-hmm.
completely without words.
Uh-huh.
And I love the way she spoke about that. And with Evan, the one phrase he said that really stuck with me is that there was a non-linguistic language
Mm.
on the other side, so that
Mm-hmm.
it was almost he talked about it being telepathic, and so many survivors of near-death experience explain it that way. That when they're on the other side, language is not spoken. It's not what it is as we think of it here, and that it's heart to heart or mind to mind. And
Uh-huh.
it seems we come into the world with that kind of heart to heart, mind to mind. As babies, we don't have spoken language yet. We
Mm-hmm.
have the capacity. We have the capacity to produce and comprehend 800 phonemes, bits of sound.
Uh-huh.
And within 6 months, that narrows. So, anyway, so we have these capacities, and both Eben and Morjani speak about them in ways that very much connect, I think, towards the threshold.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think, or what do you think this so-called nonsense talk, this language of the people at the threshold who are dying reveals about life after death?
I think it reveals a few things. One is the first kind of nonsense that I described as comprehensible nonsense, like, there's a man in a blue suit standing at my bed when there's no man in a blue suit standing there. That to me is indication that how is it that so many people, we're looking at research now um, at the Center of Hospice and Palliative Care in 2014, they studied 500 people. Over 70% had these deathbed visitors or
Hmm.
visitations. If it's such a high amount, is it really nonsense? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
how can it anyway? So there's this high percentage of people, but that's one type of nonsense, is situational nonsense where people are talking
Mm-hmm.
about it. So that's one kind. So, and that may be a harbinger of something we do not yet perceive or know, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also the nonsense of the gibberish, more like speaking in tongues. And that to me might be more a byproduct of what happens when we shift consciousness and
Mm-hmm.
and access different parts of our brains and dimensions. So I think there's different ways nonsense functions at end of life, and we just need to know more.
Yeah. 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 And you mentioned children and babies a little bit ago. Do you think children and the dying share a common language, or especially the babies?
I do indeed. That's what it looks like, in the very early research, and in two ways. First of all, we know that little ones seem to see the same unseen world that the dying often
Mm-hmm.
see. And I had this one great quote. Let me make sure I have the exact. Okay, this may not be the exact. Here it is. This one great grandfather, I believe, said about his toddler. How is it he is in both worlds at once?
Mm-hmm.
So the
Hmm.
dying grandfather looked at the little one and saw that, and there is
Mm-hmm.
a sense that they both inhabit both two worlds. And also the research I'd indicated of Jeffrey Lay and Jean Metzger indicate that there is sort of a telepathic and energetic communication between children and their parents early on in life. And it's possible that that same telepathic language that Eben Alexander and other near-death experiencers have talked about that exists at end of life or afterlife at least
Mm-hmm.
exists early on in life, and then there are signs of it, I think, at end of, as people are dying too.
Yeah. Yeah. Lisa, what do you think we can learn from final words? What do you think are some lessons?
I think we can first learn that language is a lot more than literal language, like pass me the cup,
Hmm.
Michael, that
Yeah.
language has many layers and that all of it is language. All of it is true, that there
Hmm.
is no wrong language. That language reveals a lot about consciousness, and that language can be sort of footsteps we could follow perhaps into other dimensions or other ways
Uh-huh.
of understanding the world. And then on a more practical level, for those of us who have loved ones who are dying, recording their final words or writing them down as they're dying can sometimes be a way to really enter and understand better their loved ones' processes and also to feel greater
Uh-huh.
connection. So I think there's a lot to learn from final
Yeah.
words. And oftentimes, most final words, people do express fear, of course, as they're dying, but they also express incredible awe and wonder and comfort and surrender that can, for me, has given me a whole nother sense about death and dying. I mean, I do not
Uh-huh.
feel afraid in the way I used to feel
Yeah.
afraid.
Well, you brought up what Steve Jobs said. He was
Yeah.
just in awe, and Jeffrey Holder danced his way into the tunnel. Um,
Amen.
and I think also where these final words are tapping into this eternal wisdom of superconsciousness. And I think Anita Morjani really languaged it well in her book in the final third, because one of the things she did was she talked about why she healed. She had cancer
Yeah.
riddled through tumors riddled through her body, and when she came back from her coma, she was healed, and she really languaged it so in such common plain language.
Yeah,
It just profound how she did
I
it. So she
agree.
kind of tapped into that eternal wisdom in such a beautiful way. So that's what I think that we may be able to tap into with these final words. I think you're scratching the tip of the iceberg
Yeah.
with your work.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so, and it's very exciting because just doing this research was so deeply comforting and expanding and reassuring for me,
Uh-huh.
and has I've become more intuitive just by doing this
Uh-huh.
research. It's as if by stepping into the language of the threshold, there is so much that we still do not perceive and know that is right there for us, I believe.
Uh-huh. So and maybe, for loved ones, for healthcare providers who are there at the bedside, it's something they can learn to respond to also.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And what I was very moved by is how many healthcare professionals, especially in hospice, are tuned into this.
mm-hmm.
And it's just no one's been able to do what I've done
Oh,
because they're busy serving
yeah.
their the people that they're working with and
Uh-huh.
for. So that no one's really been able to do it except for again in the book Final Gifts by Kellen and Kelly. But so many people are tuned into it more than I would have known, and it's very moving to hear how a lot of the professionals are doing very beautiful and deep work with their
Yeah. Yeah.
patients
Yeah. Yeah,
and
hospice
families.
hospice workers do such noble work. Um,
Amen.
yeah, yeah. So Lisa, what do you have a vision for the direction you see yourself taking your work at this point in time, or is it still unfolding?
It's definitely unfolding, but the vision I have and the hope I have is cross linguistic. I'm already getting samples from different countries and looking at the similarities. Are there universal metaphors that appear at end of life? And I'm really interested in Alzheimer's and the parallels
Uh-huh.
between the language of the threshold, because if I can be of service in any way to people who
Yeah.
are struggling. So I think those are my two main things. And also, we're looking for more and more transcripts of that
Oh.
nonsensical language, that language where people go, this is just, I don't understand it at all. Still write it down, still send it to the Final Words Project.
Oh. So
Yeah,
how do people connect with you then? Final word, if they want to send things, want to know more about the Final Words Project.
it
What
would be
what's
wonderful if they'd like to come to www.finalwordsproject.org.
okay?
And we have a tab
Finalwordsproject.org.
called Share Your Story, and
Oh,
people
okay.
can
So you
share.
make it really easy at finalwordsproject.org. and then share your story.
Yeah.
Do you do anything on social media, Facebook too, or the website's the main way?
Yes, I do. I mean, I have a Final Words Project Facebook, and I'm posting on it a few times a week with new
Oh,
things,
great.
and also I post with Raymond Moody on his Facebook. So come visit us there. And let's see what else. Yeah. Yeah. And also, if anyone just wants to email me, finalwordsproject@gmail.com, I'd be delighted to be in
Oh,
touch with
great.
anyone.
Final words project at gmail.com. So that's great. You're really upping the game for what can come together. And so as you say, you're still working with Raymond Moody and together on the Final Words
Yeah.
project. So that's very exciting. So um, yeah, so Lisa, I want to thank you for
Thank
just what
you.
you've done. And as I say, it's really paradigm shifting, and who knows how much more. I mean, more is going to come. Do you think there'll be another book, final word? Well, I guess it's really unfolding as we speak. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many ways, but mostly right now I'm really interested in cross-linguistic.
Uh-huh.
And I mean both of them, but I'm really interested. I mean the Alzheimer's research. But yes, who knows? It'll be fun to see.
Yeah,
It'll be
so
fun to
and
see.
yeah, I guess every day is a new adventure in terms of what submissions come in, and then
Yeah.
you cross-checking and putting it on your spreadsheet and seeing the commonalities in the language.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So great. So Lisa, thank you so much.
Thank
People can go
you,
to
Michael.
finalprojects.org.
Final words project.
Final word. I'll have this right on the interview too. So finalwordsproject.org. So thank you so much. It's been a honor to take the time to speak with you. So
Oh, thank you,
yeah.
Michael.